How do we get that extra quality to our iPhone photos and videos that some people seem to get? In fact, iPhones don't take photos like a normal camera. They use a powerful science called dynamic tone mapping. And yet, nobody's really talking about it or how to use it. In this video, I'm going to put that right. And here's my 4 tips for setting better exposure using your iPhone. Tap on the screen and hold until you see the yellow square flashing. Now your exposure and focus are locked and they won't change. But especially in daylight, iPhones generally lean towards overexposing the frame. Thing is, they know most people are taking photos of their friends and family, and they want to make sure their faces aren't covered in shadow. But it's not a particularly artistic look. So you can swipe on the screen to bring down exposure. And when you do that, colors often become richer, the shadows deeper, the frame less washed out. Now, if you tap this little arrow at the side, you open up another way to adjust exposure. The difference is this setting will remain until you change it. In the previous method, after you take a photo or a video, it resets itself. And so it's kind of a bit annoying to have to keep resetting it. This way, it's fixed and it will stay on that exposure. So setting exposure is all about balancing the shadows with the highlights, especially if there's high contrast in the frame. High contrast is when you have very bright areas like sky and sun, as well as darker areas. Often it's about deciding what's most important. You have to kind of ask yourself what you want to prioritize. Maybe the details in the sky or the details in the shadows. And that's the kind of balance that we have to weigh up. So let's finally talk about dynamic tone mapping. What this does is set exposure differently for different parts of the frame. So for example, the software will bring down the exposure of the sky without changing the exposure of the landscape below. And you can actually see this happening in real time as you move your camera around. The software kind of fills in blown out areas of the sky. And without this software, the sky would now be blown out completely white. Or you'd have to bring exposure down so far and then the landscape would be completely black. It can look like a nice photo, but that's not what the iPhone is doing. It's working against that kind of contrast, high contrast exposure. Let's look at this situation. If I tap here, the windows are blown out. But if I tap on a window, the iPhone adjusts the exposure to fill in the windows. So by playing around with where you set your exposure and using the exposure slider, you can really make a difference to the look of the frame. With this dynamic tone mapping, if you put some thought into it, you can actually turn it into quite a useful tool. Okay, and now for tip number 5.
In that title, you said 4 tips.
Wait, I've got one more really good tip.
No.